Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope the conference and the week has been really wonderful thus far. We're going to have a wonderful conversation today. I'll quickly introduce myself, give a little rundown of what we'll cover today, and then I'll let our speakers introduce themselves. I'm Lindsay Woodson. I'm a program manager with the City Support Team at the Bloomberg Center for Cities at Harvard. We're based at the Kennedy School, not too far away, but we are a university-wide center. And at the center, we work with, we equip mayors and senior officials with different types of training, resources, tools, research to tackle really challenging, complex social problems within the world. We work all across the world. We have mayors and senior leaders all across the globe on all types of policy areas. Today, we're going to focus on climate. And we're going to hear from two faculty members here at the university in terms of their work and specifically around how to, create and make moves in terms of climate action equitably. And so they'll give their perspectives. They'll each give about a 10-minute or so quick presentation. I'll have a couple questions for them, but we really hope to hear from you all for much more of the time. So thank you again so much for coming. I will pass it over to Kim to start us off.
Thank you, Lindsay. And thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. We are really thrilled to be here and in conversation with you. My name is Kim Leary. I am a professor at the Harvard Medical School at the School of Public Health, and I'm a senior fellow over at the Bloomberg Center for Cities. And I also am the executive vice president at the Urban Institute, which is a research and policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. I had the good fortune of serving in the Biden White House on the Domestic Policy Council for a year, helping to implement President Biden's executive order on equity and helping, in a tiny way, to formulate the second executive order on equity. But my interest here is thinking about the gulf that I believe currently exists between much of the activity that is taking place on climate action, which I would argue is at the level of global financing mechanisms, as well as significant technological innovations. The gap that exists between those activities and what communities are experiencing and how they understand or don't understand or are consulted or are not consulted about the larger climate conversations. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to begin by telling a story. At the Bloomberg Center for Cities in the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative, I direct our cross-boundary collaboration program, which is one of the programs that Lindsay mentioned. We bring together 10 city teams each year to work on a problem in their city that's been nominated by their mayors, and where the belief is that progress cannot be accomplished by government alone. It requires cross-boundary teams. And along with my colleague, Griffin Jones, what we do is help teams think about what it means to collaborate, what is collaborative capacity, and then what are the skills, expertise, models, frameworks, and research that support the cross-boundary piece of collaboration. But here's the story. When teaching in this program, we often study a case that you may remember, the news story, the Chilean mining rescue of 2010. Remember the story? 33 miners were trapped 700 meters underground when the San Jose mine collapsed, and no one could communicate with them. Yet, within 69 days, each miner was rescued alive. Now, in the class, we focused on what made this success possible. Certainly, Chile's president and its minister of mines unleashed unprecedented resources. They put a ton of money and financing to the rescue effort. That set of resources also enabled the best technical experts to be compensated and to bring the best technology to bear on the rescue effort. And that required them to literally, in real time, devise new drilling technologies to bore through some of the hardest rock on Earth. And then to essentially design a capsule and to pull the miners up in that capsule one by one. You may remember the pictures from back then, very dramatic. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that none of the resources and innovations that I've just described, none of the financing and technological innovation would have saved the day without the miners themselves. First, they had to figure out how to stay alive underground, under conditions of extremity and urgency. And then they had to figure out a way to make their presence known, and one might say their needs known. So when the first test drill broke through the rock near their refuge, they painted the drill bit red, and they figured out how to attach notes in plastic bags to the drill. So when the rescuers pulled that drill to the surface, they had proof of life and a set of messages. And one of them was this. Pardon my Spanish, I'm not a native Spanish speaker. Estamos bien en el refugio los 33. We are well in the refuge, the 33, which is one of the most compact and effective messages I've ever heard of, telling them where they were, who was alive, and where they could be found. Now let's think of the miners as metaphors for communities impacted by climate change. The unprecedented crises before us require financing. They require technological innovation, but we also need to leverage the expertise of communities themselves. And we already see this happening with climate action, particularly around youth groups. Think about organizations like Change the Chamber and Fridays for the Future, which not only make their concerns known publicly, they also teach their peers about sustainable energy and eco-friendly technologies. And they encourage young and future voters to support leaders that are openly committed to clean energy and green jobs. Yes, it's true that our youthful advocates protest for immediate change, and much of the change that we're talking about cannot take place immediately, but they are very eager to participate in discussions about shaping a sustainable world. So at the Bloomberg Center for Cities, we have developed something called the Participation Pathways Framework for Civic Engagement. And that effort is led by our colleague, Holly Rusan-Gilman, who is also at the New America Foundation. Now, civic engagement has a rich history. It's not new, from ancient Athens to African council systems. And it involves simply including the voices, ideas, and capacities of people and communities in democratic governance. But all too often, we default to a conventional government paradigm, where elected city leaders or leaders of other organizations try to solve problems for communities or for residents. But in a participation paradigm, city leaders and organizations partner with city residents and others to define the challenge and to collaboratively solve them. I think we probably all agree that the existential crises that we face first are interdependent, everything from climate change to inequity, the rise of AI, and our continuing vulnerability to pandemics, requires a multi-generational effort for success. But civic engagement, as critical as it is challenging to get right. Too often, well-intentioned but poorly designed engagements lead to disappointment or frustration on both sides. Sometimes it's unclear why in the world the government wants to engage residents or what it plans to do with the results of those engagements. At other times, there's a lack of equitable participation, and too many groups are left underrepresented. Engagement targets can be too broad or too narrow, and the methods used to engage people can be downright unengaging, such as inconveniently scheduled meetings or long comment forms that you have to fill out in order for your voice to be heard. So it's important to design engagements well, especially when it comes to young people and traditionally underrepresented groups. And the reason is simple. If the city's initiatives or an organization's initiatives don't resonate with their needs, they're likely to disengage and not return. So we think it's possible to deliver better civic engagement, I'm going to try this out, through what we call the 3 C's of civic engagement: co-designing, co-producing, and co-governing. And I'm going to describe each of these very, very briefly. Co-designing is exactly what it sounds like: creating a shared understanding of both the problem and the kind of engagement that might produce solutions. This means designing with residents and community members, not just for them. This might involve things like human-centered design or early-stage prototyping for a green initiative. And co-designing is crucial because it allows the integration of diverse perspectives very early in the process, ensuring that solutions are not only relevant, but they're feasible. Here's an example. In designing a new park, residents might suggest features that city planners hadn't considered. And in our recent cross-boundary collaboration, we heard exactly about this kind of issue in Louisville, Kentucky. So residents might suggest features that city planners hadn't considered, like community gardens or playgrounds that cater to children with disabilities, or in the case of Louisville, grills that are mounted actually in the park. But by involving residents from the very start, cities can create spaces, including green spaces, that truly meet community needs. Now, other cities choose to engage residents after they've already designed an initiative in the co-producing stage, and that's fine too. Think about Flint, Michigan, and work they've done in addressing distressed properties. They used a mobile app and a website that was launched in 2017, and this enabled residents to share information about property conditions, helping local government and community organizations to figure out what they were going to do in order to mitigate those challenges. So involving residents in implementation not only makes projects more successful because those projects are improved, but it also fosters a sense of ownership, pride in the community, and quite frankly, contributes to restoring trust in institutions, which we know is in very short supply. Other cities decide to invite residents into co-governing or co-deciding arrangements. This happened in Bologna, Italy, where they established an office of active citizenship, allowing any resident over the age of 16 to apply for a collaboration pact with the city. And if you received one of these collaboration pacts, you also received some funding and an opportunity to propose initiatives and submit them to participatory budgeting. So by 2020, Bologna had received over 225 of these collaboration pacts, and over 50,000 people had voted, leading to improvements, including those that were connected to climate mitigation in public buildings and in schools. And here's the thing about enhancing collaborative capacity. During COVID, the community capacity that had been built for the prior purpose was leveraged for the public health emergency. The Civic Imagination Office already had a roster of people who were engaged in their community and using tools to connect with residents and neighbors. And as you may remember, Italy was really hard hit in the early phases of the pandemic. So co-governing empowers residents to help make decisions with city leaders and right alongside of them in a collaborative way, ensuring that policies and initiatives reflect the community's priorities and values. So how do we design a civic engagement effort for climate action that works? We think it involves 4 questions. And I'm going to go through these rapidly as well. I want to make sure those are my 4 questions. Yes. Though they are basically what you'd expect. Why, who, what, and how. So first of all, you have to answer the question, if you're a city or an organization, about why you want to include community participation. Not because it's something to check the box, but because it's a way of achieving the outcomes that I've been describing. So if a city wants to increase solar panel adoption, for example, but uptake is low, it's really important to ask why. And this is what happened in Boulder, Colorado, where a solar power initiative just didn't get traction in the community. Asking why, however, revealed that people were much more concerned about forthcoming job losses in the coal industry. So when the people who are running this initiative paired opportunities to learn about green jobs along with their solar initiatives, interest grew. It wasn't magical, didn't transform, less interest to suddenly more interest, but it was a way of speaking to the interest of communities. The second question is, who should you engage? A lot of times we want to engage youthful stewards of climate action. I've heard quite a lot of that recently, and I imagine you have too. But then we have to ask, really, what do we mean when we're talking about youthful stewards? What is youth? Youth can be people from 15 to 25 years old. And if you're going to engage high school students, college students, or young people in the workforce, you probably want to do that differently because their interests and priorities are different. And similarly, when a civic engagement initiative includes City Hall or includes a given organization, you have to determine which roles within government or in the organization are crucial to address as well. So it's both sides, not just the people you're trying to engage, but those who are initiating the engagement effort. Third question, third question means asking about the subject and scope of the engagement. And transparency is really important about what an engagement will and will not include. Say you have a participatory budgeting process that focuses only on material resources for green initiatives, but does not include initiatives for new hiring in City Hall. People need to know that up front. And clear communication about scope also helps manage expectations and ensures that people who are participating understand the limitations and the possibilities of their engagement. And finally, how are you going to do all this work? And that takes us back to co-designing, co-producing, or co-governing. And the method just depends. There is no one right answer here. Different methods may be suitable for different kinds of initiatives at different stages of a project or for addressing different types of issues. But when you answer all of these questions about who, what, when, and how, you are that much closer to a thoughtful design that's aligned with your purpose, and it increases the odds of success and reduces the likelihood of failure or disappointment. Thoughtful design can also allow flexibility and adaptability as the needs and priorities of communities change over time. I believe we all appreciate that the future of our cities in particular hinges on the active involvement and innovative ideas that residents have. And when residents are treated as sources of innovation and expertise about their communities, we have a much larger fund of ideas. And when we engage residents or community members, we should expect surprises. Think about young people or those who from underrepresented communities that hadn't been involved before. They may well have very different ideas about the goals, the needs based on their experiences. And some of those ideas will complement existing initiatives. And also, residents and community members may find that government shares their concerns, albeit in a different way. So in this collaborative journey, civic engagement is really about delivering outcomes. It's not just about a process. An inclusive process elevates problem solving and delivers outcomes. And residents are not just beneficiaries of civic engagement. They can be a driving force. And when residents see that their input is valued and leads to tangible outcomes, their trust in government actors increases. So, like the Chilean miners, we can't engage in the kind of innovation needed ahead, in my view, without the leadership that only communities can provide. Thank you. Here's some more information about our efforts at Bloomberg, including some links that will take you to our materials.
Okay, this side. Hi, everyone. My name is Gary Adamkiewicz. I knew it was going to be a bad idea to follow Kim. Such a great speaker. So I'm an associate professor at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where I sit in an environmental health department. I mainly do research that looks at the connection between housing and health. I do a lot of indoor air quality work. I also my work focuses on the lens of environmental justice and the lens of environmental health disparities. And I have done a lot of work in the Boston area, specifically with the Boston Housing Authority. And just to give you a sense of my background as it relates to our topic today, I started my career working for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in their New York office. The research I do now and the research I've been doing for 20 years has largely had many civic partners and city agency partners, including at the state level, Massachusetts Department of Public Health. And I do a lot of work that has community engagement as a key feature. And I've recently been doing some co-production work internationally where we bring together city leaders in places like Accra in Ghana and Dhaka in Bangladesh to focus on city issues. So I am a true believer that there is a role for government in solving problems. There is a role for academics. There is a role for community voices to be at the center of all that. So it truly does take the proverbial village. And so today I'd like to just walk you through a little bit of my work that we've been doing over the past few years under this banner of achieving equitable change for housing. I want to start with some things that really are probably not news to this audience. It's quite a biased audience of folks who recognize the importance of the climate crisis. But even for those of us who have thought about climate change for a long time, there are data that come across your desk or across your laptop that really do startle you. And so, if you look at this evolution of temperatures over the past 100 years, and then note how anomalous the last 2 years have been, as climate scientists have known for a long time that there's always the possibility of nonlinear effects or acceleration of climate change at any point in time. People talk a lot about melting of permafrost, releasing methane, and that accelerating climate change. But this is not theory. We are in it. We are in it deep right now, and so the urgency is there, and that message has to continue to be pushed out. This was a photo from the LA Times showing an individual in Los Angeles dealing with day-to-day climate change. I do a lot of work that focuses on residential environments, families living in public housing. When you think about public problems, these are quite private situations. People experience climate change behind closed doors, and there are so many folks who suffer. They may escape to the outside with a fan to sort of get some relief. But this is a real issue for so many folks, and there are important equity issues about, what neighborhoods have green space and have some cooling, which families can afford air conditioning, what families have some means of escaping the heat that they're experiencing. Another issue, another graph to look at is, flood risk in the United States. We are all now accustomed to extreme weather events on the nightly news. And this isn't just, a climate change science story. This isn't just a health story. This is a major economic story. We don't know what the future is like. Does the future involve insurance companies going bankrupt by the dozens because we can't insure against the reality of climate change? So these are major problems with a capital P that we all need to deal with. This is Boston from earlier this year. So, cities, obviously there are cities that are more at risk. Miami has significant risks ahead, but pretty much every coastal city is at some risk for flooding events. And then you add it to all the other natural disasters. I mean, we talk about climate, weather as a natural disaster, but it's anything but natural because we basically created it. Sorry for the fact that this picture's a little blurry. This is a picture of housing that I typically study in the city of Boston. This is typical public housing in Boston, not that different from a lot of housing developments in Cambridge. Not all public housing, obviously, in either city looks like this, but 3 or 4 story brick walk-up units that are maybe 50, 60, 70 years old are the types of settings that I look at. The problem with housing is that housing needs to be maintained. One of the crises we have right now in public housing is that a lot of public housing was built in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s without a lot of money put towards maintenance or modernization over the years that have followed. So you have really a crisis nationwide. The biggest housing authority in the country is the New York City Housing Authority. They have north of $70 billion in capital needs if they wanted to upgrade their units. So that's a shocking number, but we shouldn't be surprised by it, because basically for decades we underfunded public housing and let it just sort of exist and decay. And so the families who live in this housing are the ones who suffer, because they deal with the pest problems, the mold problems, all the infrastructure problems that affect them day to day, and that leads to health problems that they also bear the burden of. I'm an indoor air quality person. I'm an environmental health person, so I have to show a scary slide with a lot of things that are bad for your health. So this, when I think about indoor environments, there are actually a lot of things we've learned about over the past 40, 50 years. Residences are actually very complicated spaces. If you think about building materials, structure, the systems that are involved, the personal care and consumer products that we bring into those spaces. But the good news is we've actually learned a lot about what it means to create healthy indoor spaces. We haven't exactly put all of that into action. So a lot of scary acronyms up here, but everything from mold and moisture to cigarette smoke to semi-volatile organic compounds or volatile organic compounds. The other thing we deal with is outdoor air pollution. If you have a perfectly pristine home, but it sits along a major highway, you are breathing unhealthy air indoors. That air is finding its way indoors. So what we've tried to do over the past 20 years is focus on research where we can find the win-win-wins, a way to, sort of modernize and keep quality up in housing, address environmental issues that exist in that housing, and also think about energy and climate change. So that's been our goal. One site where we worked on this trifecta, if you will, is a site called Old Colony in South Boston. This is a picture from it being built in the 1940s. This is an aerial shot recently, after which the Boston Housing Authority decided to redevelop the property. So it was originally an 800-unit development, and in stages, they eventually redeveloped the entire property. So I like this image because it basically shows side by side the old buildings on the right and the first phase of new development on the left. As a public health researcher interested in always answering the questions about how housing matters, for me, this was a natural experiment. If you wanted to do a study of the health benefits of green housing in Boston and just enlisted people as they came, it would be confounded to the nth degree, because people who live in green houses or green homes are more likely to be high SES, white families who live in neighborhoods that don't have a lot of pollution sources. It's hard to compare apples to apples. Here, you have public housing residents living on both sides of that line. You're in the same neighborhood, so you have all the same background exposures. The only thing that's changed is you were living in an old building with lots of environmental problems, and now you live in a building designed to be green and healthy. And so this was an opportunity that we went for in terms of a Department of Housing and Urban Development grant. I'll cut to the chase. The most important findings we found is that on the old side, on the conventional side, children were 3 times more likely to have asthma symptoms in the past 12 months compared to the green side. They were 3 times more likely to have asthma attacks on that side than the green side. 4 times more likely to have hospital visit for asthma than on the green side, and almost 5 times more likely to have a missed school day for asthma on that side. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to really put this all together and know that housing really matters. It's the air, it's the microenvironment most people spend the most time in, and for sensitive subpopulations, and I would put children with asthma at high on that list, those are going to be the individuals who benefit the most if you improve their immediate environment. Now, we didn't just look at health, we actually looked at a number of things. So indoor air quality, we found that 2 key pollutants, these are actually 2 pollutants that are regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency as outdoor pollutants. We found significant drops in those. That's a function of having a smoke-free policy, which reduces particles in the air, having proper ventilation in the kitchen, which lowers cooking-related particle exposures. The NO2 changes, nitrogen dioxide, are related to the fact that the old homes had gas stoves, the new homes had electric stoves. I'm sure you've seen some of the stories in the news about gas stoves. Happy to talk about that if you're interested. We saw these pretty dramatic health effects, and then these were old, inefficient buildings that were modernized. Just for the first 120 homes, if you look at electricity, gas, and water, our estimate in a paper we published showed that the Housing Authority was saving almost $600,000 a year on that. Now, if you don't care about kids with asthma, and there are probably people out there who don't care about kids with asthma, I'm being sarcastic. If that's not your metric, there are folks who really care about bottom lines. So if you add up the $600,000 in savings for just the first 120 homes, the significant improvements in health, which have a significant cost associated with them, these start to add up to real numbers. These are really major improvements. Just as an aside, we asked about thermal comfort. So it's really common for folks who live in low-income or public housing in Boston to actually live in overheated apartments, not underheated apartments. So for the families who are moving from old to new, many folks went from an apartment that was typically between 80 and 85 to one that was between 70 and 72. And most people felt cold. It turns out after about a year, everyone's kind of adjusts and gets used to their new norm, but it's not as if we were providing cold apartments. They were just properly heated when compared to overly heated. And we found that people had improved sleep duration as well. So I can talk more about any detail I touched on here, but for me, really thinking about housing conditions, housing quality, housing affordability, which I haven't been to a city in the world in the last 20 years where housing affordability is not one of the major issues facing a mayor or local officials. That is related to the environmental issues and the climate change issues that we're talking about. So for me, housing justice is social justice, is climate justice. There's a lot more we can do on these fronts. I'm not saying it's easy. Housing is a bit of a bear to address because we can't instantly build housing, and there are a lot of economic issues involved, but we can certainly do a better job than we have been doing. Thank you.
Alrighty, so we are a wee bit behind in terms of time, and so I want to definitely leave space for any questions that you all have or comments that you all have. But I'll just ask one question for both of you. Thinking about engaging communities, thinking about engaging different types of communities. So that's residents, maybe that's community leaders, maybe that's all types of communities. But what are the common hurdles that you have faced in your work, and kind of what's one thing that you would take away in terms of solving for that? What's the one thing that should change in terms of really making progress on climate action via civic engagement or community engagement?
For me, I think one of the key factors, which is difficult to address on a dime, so to speak, has to do with relationships. So at Harvard, in my department, we're working hard to sort of try to make sure that we're having meaningful engagement with community members and community leaders. I'll be honest, we don't have the best reputation all the time in that space, because of the strange world of academia and how people are sort of judged and promoted, and civic engagement and community engagement isn't always at the top of that list, unfortunately, but we're evolving, I should say. So I think, for me, when I think about community, I am thinking about other communities as well. So folks who basically frontline families experiencing the issues that we're addressing. For the public housing projects we've worked on, we have typically involved a lot of community members in the actual collection of the data. We've tried to also communicate that back as effectively as possible to community members. One thing that can be challenging is research takes time, and that's for folks who really want to see change. Sometimes that can be a frustrating process. When I think about other communities in terms of leaders at the city level, it really does take a long time to establish good rapport with all these people who are on the front line at the city level. So I've been around long enough where I've known some folks who work for the Housing Authority or the Department of Public Health or the Boston Public Health Commission. I've known them for 20 years now. They know I'm not a fly-by-night researcher who's going to just, take advantage of a situation and walk away. And so that goes a long way toward making sure that, there's mutual trust. And that's an issue that affects all of this work that we would like to do. There has to be trust between community leaders and community members. There has to be trust between academics and community members, and then trust between the agencies and the academics to make all this work. There's no secret formula. It would be nice if academia fully embraced the need for the models that Kim presented. This takes time. This takes thought. This is not all about getting data and p-values in a paper and publishing it. It's different. If you really want to affect change, maybe we need to change the metrics by which people are judged in their professional work. I think I went all over the place in that, but I'll turn it over to Kim.
So I think Gary's absolutely right about the challenges of people and trust. And maybe I'll answer that question, but with just a brief story from my work in the federal government, trying to work with the 30 largest federal agencies to implement the President's executive order on equity. The good news about an executive order is that it gives you the vision. You don't have to spend time thinking about the vision. The vision is there in 3 pages. But the challenge is operationalizing that vision into activities that federal agencies can deliver. This particular executive order was operationalized in a way that the agency equity teams had to include differentiated roles. People who are working frontline directly with communities, the chief financial officers, the equity officer, if there was one, agency leaders, and so on. So very specific roles that were involved. And we all know, if we read Harvard Business Review, that diversity enhances innovation and innovative outcomes. But before you get there, you run into some of the challenges that Gary was describing. You bring different people together with different sensibilities and different perspectives, thinking that that will yield innovation, and it may well. But they also bring different views of what the problem is, and they bring different ideas about how to solve the problem. And they don't magically just, coalesce into a way forward. There's debate, there's discussion, which is what you actually want. But in order to get there, it takes time, and it requires people to really understand very different points of view from their own. And when that happens, they have to agree on what trade-offs they're going to make, because you can't do everything. Federal agencies couldn't do everything in the 1 year they had to implement this executive order. And those trade-offs mean different things to different communities. So I would say that one reason we run the cross-boundary collaboration program through the Bloomberg Center for Cities is because we recognize that there is an adaptive element at the heart of getting things done. And that adaptive element means that people will look at the same problem and see something different. They will have different solutions. And you have to figure out, from a leadership perspective, how do you mobilize their learning? And how do you invite them to figure out which trade-offs they're willing to engage and which ones they're not? And as our friend and colleague at the Kennedy School, Ronnie Heifetz, says, it's not that people fear change. They fear loss. They fear loss of their usual way of doing things and their usual expectations. So it is that process of being able to work with communities and work with government officials and work with them together that can bring about that kind of trust. And I would say that on an accelerated pace, that is in fact what federal agency equity teams did do to an astonishing degree in implementing the first and second executive orders.
Well, let's just give one more round of applause for Leary and Kimberlyn. Again, I hope there are a few really wonderful questions that we have some time now to hear from you all in terms of your questions. I don't know if folks can maybe stand up and try to speak as loud as possible. Yep, please go ahead.
Hi, my question is for Kim specifically with working with functions. How exactly did you decide who you were working with and the process for finding those voices to meet people where they're at?
That's a great question. So you're right that stakeholder engagement, high quality stakeholder engagement, was one of the principles of that executive order. And agencies had to figure out how to engage in public participation that would actually yield something different than what has occurred before. So, the larger question is, who do you include? Because most public participation processes, or many of them, involve what you might think of as the usual suspects. The people who read the Federal Register and comment on, legislation and regulations and things of that sort. Or people who are on the list that get contacted for the Zoom call with EPA or with HHS. So part of the challenge is figuring out new vehicles to bring people in. And that's also what the agencies were asked to innovate, to think about how could they include more voices, and could they look across their usual suspects and figure out who was missing. Was it people from a particular age group? Was it people from a particular part of the country? Often those in rural communities tend not to be included in certain kinds of engagement efforts, and so on. So the way forward was that they also had to have a plan for stakeholder engagement. And right now, for those of you who read the Federal Register, there is actually a comment open right now on how the federal government can include their public participation pathways.
So I have a few things running in my head, and I've done a lot of co-design, co-production kind of processes in the course of my work. And I think...
Can you tell us who you are?
Oh, Karen Feinberg. I run a impact-driven innovation growth strategy consultancy affiliated with Harvard Graduate School of Education's Risk and Program. And I took Heifetz's class as well. But so a few things. So years ago, someone put out there in the ethos, if you will, an interesting survey for people to assess their organizations and their individuals' ability to take risks. And in this kind of work, I think it would be sort of interesting to identify that level of, somebody who, as someone said, their aunt moved a lamp to the other side of the room. For them, that's a big change. For others, it's much bigger, obviously. But to make that more transparent, and I also thought about speed. So I participated in a workshop that was sponsored by the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and USAID, and it was, and the speed of which decisions were made that left other people out was incredible to me. The people that were in the know, in the more power positions, were so speedy that they just left out. I just watched that, and I was just astonished of that. So that's just, it's how do you move something forward when you have to move something forward fast, but speed can kind of disrupt inclusion in a way. And then just also, it's a fine line in my experience of when you're doing co-design, where the fine line is between also taking the reins in when you're leading something without derailing, letting something get derailed because you're giving voices so much power in the mix. And that's not an easy formulaic process. So maybe you can speak to some of those. Anybody can speak something that I said.
I can start.
Yeah, sure.
So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And our colleague, Yorick, has written quite a lot about barriers to collaboration and actually the real work of developing collaborative capacity. And the trade-offs you mentioned are exactly the ones that are in play. You can move fast, but that usually means that you aren't as inclusive as you'd like to be. You can be very inclusive, but 100 days may pass and those Chilean miners may not be alive any longer. So these trade-offs are real. And at different points, you will have to make different decisions. But I think what's important is that there is an intentional consideration of the actual trade-offs that you're making. That's what I think of from a capabilities standpoint. So I'll stop there and let Gary.
Yeah, no, your comments resonate with me as well. I think, for a lot of the work I've been peripherally involved in, we're not funding major housing construction, we're just observers and we're sort of working with a partner. I'm more familiar with the world where it's working too slow, right? Rather than, but I agree with you that, the parts that matter for, the ultimate quality of the work are the ones that we speed through in many cases. And I would say, my honest answer is I don't know all the solutions to that, just because I've seen very well-intentioned people trying to make the most of every opportunity in front of them. So we have this pot of money from the federal government. This application is due by this date. We have to get a private developer, and I'm working this chess game, and then I want to incorporate community voices, and I'm not sure I have the time. How do I do that faster with respect, with maintaining, true cooperation and respect? I honestly don't have a single answer for that question. It's a tough one. What I've seen, I'll just give the example with the Boston Housing Authority, just because I've worked with them the most. There's no substitute for a really powerful person in a key leadership position to set the tone for maintaining values and substance in what people are doing every day with deadlines and everything else. And so there were a couple of people, Sandy Enriquez, who ran the Housing Authority for many years, eventually ran public housing for the Obama administration, and Kate Bennett, who recently stepped down as the Boston Housing Authority administrator. These are amazing leaders who set a tone for making lives better for the families they were serving. And that seeped into the culture of whatever. And so that, there's no formula for that either. You know, how do we create great leaders? But that goes a long way.
Right here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Adrian Fish. I work for the city of Portland, Oregon.
Yep.
And we have been struggling with climate crisis, a housing crisis, and overdose crisis. And kind of struggling to figure out how to get housing built as soon as possible. And it's resulted in a lot of like waivers for climate requirements. So energy efficiency requirements have been waived, transportation, bike storage areas and housing have been waived to try to get housing built faster. But the quality of life for the lifespan of the building and the housing budget, which the household budget, is impacted by whether or not you have access to a bike and whether or not you have an energy efficient building. And so there's like long-term concerns versus short-term concerns, and kind of trying to figure out like what are those trade-offs and how should we be kind of looking at balancing those things, knowing that people need to get off the street, but also looking at kind of the long-term for these buildings and what they mean over time.
I mean, I would say, you know more about these details than I do, probably, but the, waivers are a slippery slope, right? It's like, people really fight for, these elements that are really tied to broader goals and quality of life and health and opportunities for residents. And, it doesn't make me happy. I mean, once again, we want to house people as quickly as possible. There are lots of people struggling with this right now in every city. How do you, and then people talk about empty buildings and how do you convert them? That's not easy. You can't convert office buildings into housing quickly or easily. Maybe you can convert a hotel into housing. There are lots of complications here. So I don't have a magic answer to this one either. But I think I don't love the idea of creating a line item world where you just sort of toss aside all these things that are ultimately good for individuals, ultimately good for the city, and that's not a road. I mean, it goes against the fact that we are finding all of these things that are important, energy efficiency that is really important to our future, and it is really important to build housing that will last for a very long time, and it's important to encourage bike ride. All of these things are really important, and so if you have a mishmash of acceptance of those components, you don't really move the needle. Is the best I can do for an answer.
Please, yeah.
I think kind of building on that question, I grew up in India, and I think I'm wondering, with the research that you've done here, is there any transferability to a community where there's such a lack, or like resources are so limited, conversations about housing code or adequate space between that just doesn't exist in a lot of neighborhoods in India that actually require significant investment into justice work. So I'm wondering, how does the work that you all are doing at a local level, are there any lessons that can be moved to different nations that need social justice and climate justice investments?
So our colleague Matt Andrews has been part of our cross-boundary collaboration program. We co-directed it this year. And one of the principles of his problem-driven iterative learning model is that when you bring people together who have different ideas, we need to house people quickly, but we also need to make sure that this new regulation is met, the bike paths, et cetera. Or you bring people together and there are big things we want to accomplish, but we don't have the resources. We have some, but we don't necessarily have everything that we need. When you bring people together, they are faced with figuring out what to do in the face of a very messy problem. And often we stop at that moment and we write a paper or we form a task force and create a PowerPoint deck because we don't know what else to do in the face of a problem like that except to describe it and honor it and etc. But what Matt has brought to our cross-boundary work that's been so critical, Matt and his team, is when you bring people together, you try to figure out what are some entry points to change, not ones that, because those magic solutions don't exist, but what are some things that you can do tomorrow, next week, the week after that. And it's that kind of iterative, stepwise development of an understanding of both the problem and action scenarios that can, I think, interrupt that cycle of it's just too messy for us to figure out what to do and move the thinking so that people identify a set of things they can do that may not make the newspaper. You know, I went and talked to so-and-so, but by virtue of talking to that person, it gets another door open and or attracts somebody on social media. I'm just making this up on the fly. So I think those entry points and of being rigorous and ambitious about your entry points can lead to, over time, more realizable ambition at a larger scale level. But you can't start here. You're going to start over here. That might be one way I'd respond to your very good question.
And I'll just echo that in terms of, I think so many of the elements that Kim talked about are really transferable. You know, I have worked in other settings where, where these models of co-production, really, and there's some models that academics are very comfortable with that do work in these spaces. I think about what the design school here does in terms of design studios or charrettes, or, there are ways that we can engage that really are about, deciding on goals together, deciding on needs together, deciding on, what's the question we're trying to answer, what's the problem we're trying to solve, and whether there are whether building code is strict or lax doesn't necessarily get in the way. Obviously, safety is a concern for any time you're building structures, but I think a lot of this is very transferable.
Right here. Hi, Dana Hoffman. I work for City of Denver Transportation Department. Thanks for this talk. I'm happy to say that our department, I think, is doing more work in that co-production, co-governing space. We have participatory judging. We have projects where people are really engaged. And one thing we're starting to really run into is that, as we bring the work to the community, it's a lot of work, and we're not the only ones doing this. And so we get into this space of, what we're calling like engagement fatigue. People are really tired, and often we're leaning on community leaders to bring us to the right people, for something else. How do you guys think about not fatiguing your communities while also continuing to ask them to engage in this level on very many problems and projects and programs and all of those things?
I'll just say quickly that I think that that's the next innovation cycle that we really need with community engaged methods. Because right now what you just described is the status quo. Identify 5 leaders, and those are the same 5 leaders that 5 different initiatives have identified, and the same group of people are engaged, and the community feels that they're being that the whole process is extractive, right? That's not what we want from genuine engagement and really leveraging the expertise of others. But that means rethinking some of our base systems. So, for example, in the federal government, there are rules and regulations about how you engage communities, and limits on what you can do if it can be done in some other way. So it goes to the base, I would say, of this participation pathways model, which is, what are you really trying to achieve here? What are you really trying to achieve? I would say one amendment to something I said earlier is, we said, for some, community engagement is checking the box. I've been very influenced by our colleague Atul Gawande and his checklist manifesto. It is not always a bad thing to check the box. It means that you actually take care of things. But we need to do more than that. We need to figure out how to engage communities in the ways that they wish to be engaged, and we need to partner with them to also understand how we can do that work better. And that's why I think this participation work that the federal government is trying to seek comments on right now is so critical.
All right, well, thanks so much, everyone. Unfortunately, Gary has to jet, so if you have any questions, lingering questions for him, I'm happy to.
And if you want to reach me, the only test is you have to spell my name. If you Google this name, there are only 2 of us in the United States that have this name. You will find me.
But I think Kim can stay around for a couple minutes if you have any last questions. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.